I always like to point that out whenever people are asking about pest problems or what to do, is first, you're probably not going to be able to completely get rid of them. Maybe your plants aren't going to be looking beautiful and like picturesque that you see on like Instagram or other websites, but that doesn't mean they're unhealthy or any like not edible. But some of these techniques can definitely help with production and growth and things like that. And really, we take a holistic approach to pest management. So some of you have maybe already seen this, basically the IPM pyramid. This one's a little different than other ones, but I like to put it in here instead. Sometimes this prevention in the bottom is not on there, but I like to put it in there just because I really like to point out, like, really thinking through and planning is usually one of the best steps with dealing with pests. But how this pyramid kind of goes, and like with most pyramids, the bottom is the most important, and the top is the least important, or the least, or what we want to do last. So we basically, with this pyramid, we kind of move from the bottom up. So you shouldn't be using any of these. We don't really want to be using any of these chemical things if we haven't done any of these other approaches. But how we kind of break this down and how I like to categorize it, you'll see it differently on different places, different extension sites, is kind of our prevention is really thinking about what pests we could have and trying to eliminate the habitats of those pests. Getting your system set up to where proper watering can be done. And then also really starting out at the beginning is thinking about what crops to be planting and really looking at doing kind of ones that have more immunity or protection against common pests. Your cultural or sanitation, I like to think of this as kind of like what you're doing once your garden is like getting started. So like cleaning up any dropped fruit or vegetables, anytime you do any pruning, if you're doing prunings on tomatoes, things like that, pulling those branches out. Intercropping and some trellising, and we'll be talking about some different techniques with that. And then after you've done that and you've kind of got your stuff planted and planned, those physical and mechanical ones. So some examples would be like a row cover or going out and hand picking bugs. Hopefully you do that after you do your row cover, because if you let the bugs basically, if you let your insect pests get too much, it's just, I mean, you'll be out there all day. And then some biological. So you can even, and sometimes this can get thrown into prevention as well, as design your space to have some more predation and more habitat creation to introduce predators. And we'll talk about some other ones of that. And then finally, the chemical. And so sprays and some other techniques. All the ones we have in this presentation will be, they're organic certified ones. We get that question quite a bit, but just want to point that out. And we'll be following this through. So we'll start at the bottom through this presentation and move up. So first, how does a plant get a pest? Really there's three factors, and they all need to be present to get a pest. First, you need a plant that is susceptible to whatever pest this is. And then you do need that pathogen or pest to be there. And then you need an environment that encourages it or allows that pest to get large enough or whatever to actually be able to attack that susceptible plant. So when we're talking about pests, a lot of people think of like, well, first of like insect pests, but we can also be thinking about larger pests. So like if like you have problems with rabbits or squirrels, those would be pests. You would consider those pests as well. If you have any like fungal diseases or anything like that in your plants, that would also be a pest as well. So really it's a pretty a wide ranging term. But using the IPM pyramid, you can really focus it towards any pest that you find. So first, kind of starting in that prevention, that prevention part of the pyramid is really thinking about, and I always tell people, is really to think about what plants you're planting first. There are just some plants inherently that will have more pests than others. And really, it seems to be the plants that people love to plant the most, and I love to plant as well. And I'm talking about a lot of our cucurbit, so our squashes, our cucumbers, our tomatoes, things like that. Those plants all have a lot of pests. And probably if you've grown any of those, you've found like you get squash vine borer, or you get fungus, or you get some type of viral disease in your tomatoes. And so first, maybe planting some other plants, but if you really are going to stick with those, which we do too, but if you do, then look into the different varieties that are out there. Don't just go, if you have quite a bit of problems with pests, don't just go to Home Depot or Lowe's and just buy whatever seed packet looks good. Do a little bit more research. So if you go online and look at some seed websites, so I really like High Mowing Seeds. I know our website at Gateway Greening, we do sell some seeds as well. And look for those that are either hybrids or have some disease resistance. And usually if it's a hybrid, it has disease resistance. So if you look for those, you can get a little bit better. Ones I really try to focus on that have hybrid or disease resistance is summer squashes. So zucchinis, yellow squash, a lot of the cucumber families, these all have quite a bit of diseases that come through, and the hybrids and disease resistant varieties do a lot better. So. Also, if you're thinking of, I talked a little bit about this, but there are also some similar plants that aren't of the same family that are a lot less susceptible. So for example, and we talk about this a lot at Gateway Greening, is you can actually grow some squashes that are really great outside of Machada family, Machada species. So you're thinking of like butternut squash, or other varieties like that, which have a lot of problems with vine borers and squash bugs. We've, at our demonstration garden, substituted those with Seminole pumpkins and Tromboncino squash, which both have, just really are a lot less susceptible to both squash bugs and vine borers. They're not fully resistant, but we find definitely with vine borers, they're just really not interested. We've even done demonstrations where we've had Tromboncino planted like right next to butternut squash. And the butternut squash has been taken out by vine borers, and the Tromboncino squash is doing great. If you don't know what a Tromboncino squash looks like, it's this guy right here in the top right. It does this like curl sometimes it drops straight. I've got quite a few pictures in this presentation because it's such a cool looking squash. And it's a vining squash. You can treat it like a summer squash. And then if you let them sit on the vine, you can treat them kind of like a winter squash as well. Also, just a recommendation I usually put out there, but like some red or purple brassicas. So like this cabbage right here on the right, they're not really any more resistant to anything, but definitely when you're looking at pests, a lot of different like cabbage loopers and other insects have evolved to be green so that they're hidden from birds or other predators. But on a purple one, they'll stick right out. So you could easily get it and pull them off. So just thinking of some other variety approaches first before we start getting into other things. Like I was mentioning, some other equivalent species also within cucumbers. If you're looking at, if you have a lot of trouble with getting cucumbers going, Armenian cucumbers is a really nice alternative. They do also have some problems with fungus, but they do a lot less than other cucumbers. Or say you can also really just start thinking about growing some other varieties that seem to have a lot of less pest issues. So if you're kind of new to gardening, or you just have grown a lot of like tomatoes or cucumbers and you find every year you don't get much out of them, maybe think of adding in some other plants that are pretty pest resistant in general. So like okra, sweet potatoes, lettuce, a Malabar spinach are all really great. And so then that is kind of leading us into our first step, is really planting for diversity. So really, you hear this a lot of talking about like companion planting and like different planting techniques. And really, I always just tell people is really try to plant a combination of plants. Our goal is really to create a polyculture of a garden. So we have lots of different plants in there. This is like a beautiful picture with lots of different things flowering at different times. And then this variety really can reduce the amount of pest pressure you have. because these plants are all growing at different levels. Pests that need to get to a certain amount to really be making damage on your plants. There just isn't enough of your plants for them to get to. Some of them are protecting other plants. So keeping plants happy is another really important part to managing pests. So if you're growing, say, like lettuce or something and it's starting to get warm out, but you still need it to keep growing until it's done, having larger plants around it, say like some kale in this picture, can provide some additional shade. You can do some trap cropping. We're not going to really talk much about it because I find for home gardeners, you really don't have enough space for trap cropping. But really that technique is planting. It's really where you're like, I understand I have these pests here, so I plant these plants specifically to trap, to attract those pests, and then you really get rid of it. You see it larger at the farm scale. There's a couple different squash varieties that really do that. But I really, for home gardeners, I've found most people aren't interested in it just because you really are already limited on space. So you don't really want to waste space to grow something you're not going to eat. So. A little bit about companion planting, because this is, I think, a pretty important part that everybody is really interested in for these, is really companion planting in its most basic sense is just planting different crops in proximity to each other. There can be a range of benefits for this. A lot of people think of it more as like, oh, how are the plants like interacting in the soil and things like that? But there are some other reasons that you would be doing companion planting as well, outside of the pest control. Just based on like sizes and structures of plants, you can really increase the productivity of your space. Increasing pollination is a really important part. So a lot of people that are growing at home, if you're growing in like a grassy lawn or near a lawn, and maybe not a lot of plants, a variety of plants are around you, adding in a lot of different pollinating flowering plants into your garden can really help increase pollination. And that really, again, increasing that diverse habitat and maximizing space. So a common one I like to recommend is really sticking your alliums. So these are onions right here in this picture, and sticking those kind of around any brassicas. So we got collards here, but you can do it around kale. The great thing with onions is they really don't need a lot of space, so you can really cram them in. We, at a lot of our demonstration beds, will stick them around the edge in just one row. So they're just kind of a full border around whatever plants are in the middle. There has been some research on alliums having some resistant, or really like resisting whiteflies or some smaller insects. So looking at adding in alliums and onions kind of wherever is really great. Also adding in lots of flowering plants, really just attracting more insects, getting more activity will reduce your pest pressure. So some really specific species I really like. Borage is really great. There's tons of other great things about it. Sunflowers, chamomile, calendula is really great, nasturtium. You can find tons of lists online about these, but these are just some ones I really love because I also like the flowers off of them. And so I always, when people are asking like what flowers to grow, you can look them up, but also like if you're going to use the flower, what are you going to do? Are you going to use the flowers? Because I like to think about what you can grow in the garden that can get you the most benefit. For you're going to use them for cut flowers, take them inside, things like that. So here's just a list of kind of some other ones that there's a lot of these lists online, and I try to find the ones that seem to have the most research or evidence behind it. And so this is kind of a list of ones that that there's out there that can repel pests of different flowering plants. So since we'll probably send this presentation out afterwards to everybody, or I'll let you email to get it, I'm going to probably move forward so I don't have to kind of read off the list, and we can make sure we get to some other things. Some annual plant combinations. The Three Sisters Garden is a great most people probably know this, really because it uses that space so well. The crowding out with the squash, beans growing up, and really using that vertical space to get really good airflow in is a great combination, but also lettuce and tomatoes do really well together. They're not grown in the same seasons, but using lettuce in your spring to cover the soil. And then when it's time to plant tomatoes, you plant them around it. And by the time the lettuce comes out, there's enough space for the tomatoes to keep growing. Beans and radishes kind of do the same thing where you're planting your radishes early. And then like I was talking about, those alliums around lots of other plants. So if you like onions, I highlight, like if you like to eat onions, you should think about really adding them into a lot of different spaces in your garden. We don't anymore even just grow a bed of onions. They're just kind of in almost every single bed. So kind of thinking about like when you're looking at, so that was kind of all the like types of plants and things like that. But really one of the best ways to reduce pest pressure is making sure you've got a healthy plant. So first, picking a good site. So making sure you have plenty of sunlight. Having a spot that maybe is getting some airflow, but not really getting a ton of wind blowing on it. Well-adapted plants. So that's again, looking at those varieties and starting out with those good plants as well. And then following planting calendars for your region. So planting at the right time, making sure you're consistently watering it. It doesn't matter how well-bred that plant is for resistance. If you're not treating it well, it's going to become more susceptible. And then always recommending is really mulching, and we'll talk some more about soil health in a bit. But mulching with compost or leaf mulch is really great for vegetables. You can use straw as well, but I prefer the compost and leaf mulch because it adds some nutrients to the soil. And like I was saying, watering consistently as well. And then, and this is kind of, most people probably know, but really make sure you water the soil and not the leaves. So, and then with your plans as well, really you should think about if you have some pest pressure, or even if you don't, but you're trying to make sure you get as much nutrient, you're making sure your nutrients of your soil go well, is think about rotating those plants. So doing a pretty basic crop rotation can really provide a lot of benefits. You don't need to do, this picture on the right is a 4-year rotation. You don't really need to do that. But if you do have a couple beds that you're growing in, at least like 2, you can do a pretty small rotation. And if you are, then I would highly recommend focusing on your fruiting plants. So in this kind of bottom right here, but your cucumbers, tomatoes, squash, eggplants, peppers, any of your melons, things like that, they all have quite a bit of pests, and some that even live in the soil year after year. So if you rotate those, you're going to reduce some pest pressure. Now, some people have the question is like, well, you just talked about planting a bunch of different plants in the same bed. So how do I do a rotation with that? And that's a very good question. And really that's why I say is if you're going to be doing it, focus on your fruiting plants. So if you planted tomatoes in one bed and say you had some radishes around it, maybe some lettuce and some onions, but then at a different bed that same year you planted cucumbers, maybe some okra and some other stuff. Just switch those for the next year. So your tomatoes and your cucumbers, while you're growing in the same, you're still growing both those in beds, they're switching beds. Ideally, you'd probably like have a whole year where you weren't, but if you're growing because you want to eat tomatoes and cucumbers, then doing at least like a flip of that can still give you quite a bit of benefits. Some mulching as well. So for pest management, mulching and really just overall soil health is really important. A real big goal with a lot of like growing with gardening, I tell people is to really avoid bare soil. So think about after you have your plants in, maybe your seeds have germinated, what you can do with the rest of the bare soil around. First, try to get as much planting in there as possible, but then from that, look at what you can cover the soil with. So you can use a leaf mulch, which leaf mulch is probably the best thing to use. It's usually the most expensive and not free and available. But doing leaf mulch, compost also, so really just treating kind of like compost as a leaf mulch. Us here in St. Louis are really blessed with the fact that the city of St. Louis provides free compost to all residents, so we can get compost. You can also use straw, and straw is really, it still does that protection. The one thing with the leaf mulch and the compost is they'll be breaking down over time, so they'll be adding nutrients to the soil as well, which does mean you usually have to reapply after a couple months. But with straw, it really won't be breaking down. One thing is, though, if you do have a lot of problems with squash bugs specifically, straw is like a great environment for squash bugs to live in. At night, they like to go into like cool, dry, like cool, dark places. And so like under straw, they're just kind of hiding out underneath the whole time. And that's kind of the same with wood mulch. And also the one thing is with straw and wood mulch is don't incorporate that into the soil at the end of the year. Make sure to take it off when you're adding some compost or doing other things like that. And then when we're talking about that planning with the pests is really thinking about optimizing space. So really thinking about like airflow. Airflow is very important. Definitely when talking about different like fungal diseases. So trying to get airflow through the space, but also still getting plants with enough sunlight. So here's a picture right on the left is in early spring, and then on the right, I think is in probably, I would guess probably June, of some rows of crops where there's carrots planted on the side and there's beans up top. So the carrots are on the side. They germinate a lot earlier, but take quite a bit to grow. And then the beans up top will be growing up these trellises. Really nice thing is that then the beans will actually start shading out some of the carrots too, which once they've gotten big enough, that's really good here because they get so hot that it can really slow down their growth. So keeping the carrots healthy and happy. So just a little other design of planting in the spring I like to point out is when definitely here us in the Northern Hemisphere of planting is in the spring, we're really limited by sunlight for our cool season crops. So planting on the south side is really good. So you plant those cool season crops on the south side. And if you're going to be planting your tomatoes or eggplant, okra, plant them on the north side. And then usually those big warm season crops are growing most of the season. So they'll still be in the ground when you're planting your cool season crops in the fall. So just try to plant them then, those cool season crops on the north side to keep them happy and healthy too. And really that optimizing space really gives you that benefit of first you're getting more produce out, you're also getting some weed suppression, you're really protecting that soil. You're protecting a lot of those sensitive plants. So like right here with some lettuce around some tomato plants, when those tomato plants are pretty young, they're pretty sensitive. So they're giving some protection. You're also still getting lettuce while your tomatoes are maturing. So if you don't do a lot of trellising, trellising can really, is a really great way to first kind of start looking at ways to prevent pests. Also just trellising, I mean, it makes your garden look cooler because it's vertical space. Usually we have mostly horizontal space in our gardens. You get more sunlight, so you can get even more production of plants. It's easier to water, so you can be watering right at the base of the plant versus trying to find where the actual root system is. It is a lot easier to monitor for pests because they're right at eye level. And I find it's much easier to harvest as well. And so like beans and peas, a lot of people think like that's pretty much like that's what you need to be growing up on trellises. But you can also do plants like winter squashes. So these are those Seminole pumpkins I was talking about growing on a cow panel trellis. So you can do some pretty fun, simple things like this, where you can make an arbor out of these. The structure is strong enough to be able to support it. Just make sure they can. And the nice thing with winter squashes is as long as it's not like some giant pumpkins are growing, they're vines can support the weight of the plant. When you start getting into like watermelons, which you can trellis watermelons, you do need to find something to provide some extra support for the fruit. So you can either use old t-shirts to kind of create like a hammock. I've seen people use a bunch of other different types of fabrics, things like that. So, and then with summer squashes also, you can do some trellising. I didn't have a great picture of it, so I couldn't add it on. But if you kind of look, if you do some Googling, you can find some great YouTube videos on trellising zucchini and other yellow squash. It isn't going to look like this where it's like vining, because they're not vining plants, but it's lifting them up off the ground. You get some more production out of them, but it also really can increase the airflow. And those squash plants have a lot of different fungal diseases on their leaves, which can really, that's what usually stops them from growing. So increasing kind of that height really increases the airflow and can keep it down. So. And while you're also managing your plants, so you're looking at trellising, always just make sure to be cleaning up in your garden. So anytime you're doing any pruning, things like that, take it off. If you've seen any rotten fruit on the ground or on your like tomato plants or things like that, make sure to pick them up off of there. When you do prune, if you're finding that like specifically like maybe your tomato plants, if you do have disease on some of your tomato plants, and it would probably be a good idea to really wash your pruners in between plants. You can just use some rubbing alcohol, and that works really well. If you're composting at home and you're finding some of your plants are diseased, if you're not getting your compost up to basically commercial compost temperatures, you should think about putting them into a yard waste bin, or if you don't have yard waste in your area, just kind of into the trash. You don't want to be adding those diseases basically into your compost that then you're going to be putting back out onto your garden. So. And don't feel bad about pulling out a diseased plant if it's next to other healthy plants. Go ahead and do it. If you notice only one that has a disease while others don't, if you don't rip it out, you'll probably see the rest of them will be getting that disease as well. So kind of moving into those physical barriers. So we were kind of covering a lot of that prevention and cultural and sanitation within the pyramid. Moving into those physical barriers, covering your plants can be really effective in reducing pest pressure. It's one of the simplest ways, and it's reusable, which is great. This picture on the right didn't load perfectly well, but these are some plants with row cover around them. Or an insect netting. I think that's probably an insect netting actually. But row cover insect netting you could be using, and it really can help with different insect plant pests, but also with like squirrels and some other mammals and birds as well. There's really, people think of, there's usually two different types. So there's insect netting or row cover. You can get some different weights of row cover. Row covers here on the left with this insect netting on the right. If you're doing a lot of early spring planting or late fall planting, row cover is probably the way you're going to go. It provides a little bit more, it provides a little more frost protection and just a little bit more insulation in it. Usually I think it's about 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit for most row covers. You can look at the different sizes and they're rated based on the amount of sunlight they let in. But you can use these through, usually when we use these, we just keep them on even through the summer as long as it's not blazing hot. But if you are worried about just increasing the temperatures under your row cover, you can always just use insect netting instead, which is right here on the right. It's a really great fabric. It doesn't do any frost or temperature change, but it really keeps all of your insects out. The one thing with both of these is you should be using them right when you plant. You shouldn't put them onto plants after you start to see pests, because what you're doing is you're just trapping the pests in with the plant that they like, and you're really kind of defeating the purpose. So best way to be really doing these is if you're planting by seed or seedlings, plant, and then really just put the cover on them right after they're planted. You can water through these, through both of these. If you are going to do that, just make sure you don't water it like do a little bit lighter watering, just a little bit longer. Definitely if you have seeds in the ground and they haven't germinated, the water kind of pools and drips into below that. It's not as nice like spray as you're using. If you can do some drip irrigation, that would be preferred, but not everybody has that. For putting these on, PVC or metal rings really can do a really good job holding up the covers. We sell, I think, the metal rings and actually I think the row cover and insect netting, but you can also get them at pretty much any garden store. You can buy them online, things like that. And then you need something to hold down the sides. So it does no use if the sides are open. Then you're really just kind of providing like a patio basically for your plants. You're not really protecting them from any pests. So make sure to put either some, like you can buy sod staples, which work really well. The one thing with sod staples is they put a hole into the row cover or the insect netting. So you just got to make sure you don't pull it too tight or else you're tearing it. Bricks, other heavy things just to hold the sides down work really well. I've seen people make kind of almost a frame with PVC and row cover to where it's just like kind of a permanent thing that they can move around. That works really well. So, the one thing with any of these is you really want to make sure you mulch. So if you're planting by seed, you'd have to wait for the seeds to germinate. But if you're doing seedlings, mulching under these is really useful because with how the watering goes, that mulching will help retain moisture in there, just keeps the plants also a little bit more protected, but it's found to be a lot, it creates plants that are a lot healthier. So. And then people do always ask about like squirrels and things like that. With squirrels and dealing with squirrels, if you're growing tomatoes and squirrels are stealing your tomatoes, outside of just fully enclosing your plants like this, I don't really know of some great ways. People talk about like doing sprays. Some people say that they're really just thirsty, so they are just taking a bite out of the tomato. So if you leave some water out for them, they'll be fine. They won't eat them. But we've tried all that and we still get squirrels eating tomatoes. So I'm always interested in hearing people's comments and like recommendations and trying it, but I think really they just like to eat tomatoes. And so when they see them, they eat them. Found cherry tomatoes, they eat less of them. So that works a little better. But fully enclosing, well, this works. It keeps them out. It's a lot of work because you have to build a full enclosure and then you have to get into it. But if you only have a couple beds, it might not be a terrible option to think. This is just chicken wire around it. So some other physical barrier and specific pests. So squash vine borers are a really big problem for most of our squash plants. So covering the base of your squash plant, so like whether doing a full physical cover with a row cover, and we'll talk about that in a second, or actually just using compost and soil to really build up a hill around the base of it can really be great. And that can kind of reduce it. And we'll talk a little bit about the vine borer here in a second. But those bases can really help with some preventing the actual insect from laying eggs at the base of the plant. I've seen other people use foil to do that as well. I haven't heard great results with that. If you do have a lot of problems with squash vine borers, I would just recommend, and if you're gonna grow summer squash and butternut squash, is just to go with a full cover. So take a row cover or an insect netting and plant your seeds and then just cover them up and keep them covered until at least you start to see flowers. So how the vine borer, how the life cycle of it goes is it's a moth that will be flying around laying eggs at the base of squash plants. Those eggs hatch, and then they eat their way up into the base of the squash plant right at the right above the roots. So basically it's stopping all nutrient flow to the rest of the plant. And so if you can stop that initial laying of the eggs, you can usually miss it. The one thing here, and this is, I know mostly just about Missouri, but south of us, I know a lot of those, they have two full life cycle generations. While usually here, Missouri, we only have one. So you'll see a whole nother set planted. You'll see a whole nother laying of eggs in late summer. And if that is the case, you can either just deal with it and hopefully you've got enough squash out of it, or you can just keep them fully covered the entire season and you can actually do some self-pollinating. With squash plants, that's not a huge deal because you're not getting as many you're not getting as many fruits out of each plant. You could do the same thing with others, but squash seems to be the most useful. If you are interested in doing that, I'd really just watch a YouTube video. They're really useful, but really you just take the male flower, you just pull off a male flower, and then you just you can use a brush, you can actually just stick it into the female flower, and you've basically pollinated it. A quick 30-second YouTube video will show you how to do it. It's great. You can, if you do already have vine borers in your squash plants, you can try to cut them out. So a really good way to tell if you have squash vine borers is if you see at the base of your squash plants in late June, July-ish, some holes and some like orange goo on the sides of those holes. That means you probably have vine borer. You can take a knife and cut into it and try to pull out the grub. The one thing is if you do that, you might be killing your plant also. I've had some moderate success taking like clothespins and just stabbing it into the side to try to kill it while it's inside of there. But the covering, if you're really doing the prevention ahead of time, the covering is like one of the most effective methods. While you're also out dealing with insects and you're doing watering and harvesting, always, and people talk about this all the time, but make sure you're doing your scouting. So really recognizing what definitely insect pests you have, but also if you're finding tomatoes strewn throughout your garden with one bite out of each, you probably have squirrels eating your tomatoes. But making sure just seeing what insects are out there. If you're seeing like eggs on the back sides of your kale or your squash plants, they're probably a pest. So right here for squash bugs is on the back side of a squash plant. So just paying attention to those. If they're like this, you can just take your finger and just kind of rub it on the side. If you catch those, and then if you also do catch like some small like harlequin bugs or squash bugs, throwing them into like a cup of like soapy water and getting them early can really be effective, versus like letting them get out of control and then by hand picking at that point, it's pretty much useless. So some other design things to think about is really you could add in, and usually with home gardeners, you've already got some flower or some trees or other large structures around. But if you don't, you could think about putting in like a bat box, like this one on the right. They really help with a lot of moths. You could do some, if you have chickens, you can let your chickens run through your garden beds during the winter, or really when you're not growing things. If you don't have that, you can always do the throwing bird seed out on your beds or under your trees. They can really help, and also you're adding in nutrients, they're moving soil around. It's really a great beneficial thing. Also think about, and this is where kind of jumping into that biological part of the pyramid, is really supporting your kind of even your smaller insect allies. So that is really where bringing in lots of flowering plants and just trying to have a continuous bloom of plants, just so you have lots of activity around, is really great. Your ladybugs, things like that, and different types of parasitic wasps. So like if you have tomato hornworm, I don't think I actually have a picture in this presentation, but if you have tomato hornworms on your tomatoes, there's a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs on them. So if you find one If you just Google tomato hornworm, and if you Google tomato hornworm and parasitic wasp, you'll see what the difference looks like. And it'll have basically a bunch of eggs on the back of it. You always want to make sure you leave those, because when they hatch, you'll have tons and tons more of those that can really reduce your hornworm population. They're also one of those pests with scouting where if you find them, it's really just like you should pull them off and get rid of them. It's a pretty effective strategy because you're not going to have thousands of them. You'll probably only have a few. And then really you want to be supporting, as we say, your micro allies or your soil. So we do talk a lot about like the different pests on plants and things like that, but some of the most effective ways to have a pest-free garden is really having a great healthy soil. And this is where I'm going to make a plug for tomorrow night. Dean will be teaching a class on soil health. I'd highly recommend watching it or watching the video later. But there is tons of new research on the benefits of creating a healthy soil. There's a lot of different things, and we have, as with Dean's class tomorrow, there's whole classes that are on it. But really those healthy soils, I mean, you get more yields, your soil fertility, there's those disease organisms get outcompeted by our good organisms, more holding capacity for water, things like that. Some ways that you can do this. The number one, most effective way is really just not tilling your soil. It's something I know a lot of people don't want to stop doing because it makes it a lot easier. But really fully tilling your soil, really just kind of you're resetting your soil pretty much. You're killing most of your soil life and microorganisms and all the different things interacting in your soil. So another technique that you could use is using a broad fork, which is right here on the right, or a digging fork. Definitely if you have some really compacted soil. So you can do that early in the season before you have anything planted. And then take some compost and add that compost on top. So after you have that broad fork and digging fork in there, they've loosened the soil up. You have some gaps in the soil, which then allows compost to kind of fall in there, and also allowed some aeration through your soil. And that can really, that is probably one of the best ways to create healthy soil. Another great way is making sure that you have something growing, or roots at least, always in your soil. So this is where cover crops can really come in. I'm not going to really spend a ton of time on them, but cover crops definitely during the winter are a great way to just keep your soil covered, insulated, and then keep nutrients in there as well. You can also use compost teas. If you're looking at doing some compost teas, I would recommend doing a little bit more research on the best techniques for doing it. It's not as simple as just dumping compost into water. There's some thought you need to be done about aeration and how fast you use that compost tea. But there's some really great research on spraying that onto leaves and providing a lot better, more beneficial microbes on those. So for cover crops, I'm just going to quickly just mention, usually if you're looking at doing cover crops, you kind of break them into two different types. So you have your warm season cover crops. So you plant these during our warm seasons when there's no chance of frost. Common ones we use are buckwheat, Japanese millet. They both grow really fast. Our school gardens sometimes use these when they can't really plant anything over the summer. I find a lot of home gardeners probably don't use these because during that warm season is when most people are growing things. Cool season cover crops is a little more often used. You'll see some winter kill annual ryegrass, and though that winter kill is dependent on where you are growing and what your climate is, or overwintering mix of a rye and veg mix. So, and these dates are based on St. Louis, Missouri. I'm just going to make sure. All right, we're flying. If prevention and all that has failed, and you still have your pests, really that last step is kind of our chemical step. But you've probably hopefully been doing your scouting in your garden. Definitely if it's an insectal pest, so you can have an idea of what type of pest it is. And when you have a rough idea, getting some more information of what its life cycle looks like, what specific plants does it impact, and does it overwinter? These are really the big questions you want to ask yourself, because some of the sprays we're going to talk about in a second, while they'll work against maybe that pest, but they might not work against that pest at its life cycle. So here's just an example of a life cycle right here. I do always want to put, like, if you do have pests, don't feel like you can't just go out there and pick them off. If it's a really bad infestation, you're probably going to waste some time, but definitely early in the season, you can really do a lot of good by just going out there. If you see some squash bugs, just throwing them into a cup with some like soapy water in it does a really great job. Just a little mention of, like, it's a lot harder to do with fruit trees, but definitely if like in your annual garden, yeah, think about doing that. So, all right, so we're going to just jump right now into a bunch of different sprays and different things to recommend. So first, whenever you're just kind of looking at those varieties, but also some other diseases just to be thinking about, are two different mildews, those downy mildew and powdery mildew, which affect a lot of squash plants and cucumbers. Are wilts, which you'll see in a lot of tomato plants, and same with your mosaic virus as well. So, all right, so these chemical controls. So one of the first ones, and really all these, like I said earlier, are organic, but insecticidal soap, probably one of the like safest and most easily used ones. Usually comes in something like this. If you have any like aphids, whiteflies, so many like really small like spider mites, if you see on like your eggplant or kale, and it seems like there's a lot of small little holes and it's kind of dried out, you might have one of these, and so insecticidal soap could be a way to take them on. It doesn't really work with caterpillars or beetles. It's they're too large and it's not effective. It does need to be sprayed on the pest to be effective. Really, like just spraying it, like, so it means when you're spraying it, spray it on the leaves, make sure you really get it onto where those pests are, because if it's not going to be one of these that just sits there for a while. Neem oil, this is one that you see a lot in recommendations. Really, it's because it's used a lot for different things, really a systemic insecticide. It also does have some like antifungal properties, which is really great. Pretty much any insects that eat leaves are disrupted by neem oil. It's very safe, which is good. I do recommend just like putting some gloves on, just because for the concentration amount, it just might give you like a little bit of an irritation or a rash. It's really good for a preventative for any mildews or fungus. So if you find like every single summer, if you're like in Missouri where you have hot, humid summers, and sometimes the days just like there's no airflow, you find your squash and cucumbers just get a lot of mildew, spraying some neem oil on beforehand can really reduce that. And then if you are going to use it, this is one of those where it's really good to spray it like once a day for a couple days in a row. So it's not one of those just like do it once and you're good. Really get a good like 3 days in a row of sprays. It works against a lot of different plant pests, though it works a lot more effectively against smaller ones. So you're like aphids and whiteflies, things like that. It is an oil. So if the temperature is about like 90 degrees and you've got like no clouds, I would really try to avoid spraying it that day, or maybe spray earlier in the day. And then try to avoid spraying on flowers. Usually you're using this on a lot of like large leafing plants or squash plants. So the leaves are pretty big, so you're really not near any flowers, but just really try not to get them in there. There has been some studies showing it can disrupt some bees and some other native pollinators, but as long as you're not spraying it right into the flowers, you're fine. BT. So this is one that is not, so the one with the neem oil, it direct contact, it works, but also it does work on plants that eat, or work on pests that eat the plant as well. It goes through that method, that pathway as well. BT, so this one is can only be, it only works when it's ingested by the pest, and it works specifically on caterpillars. We use this pretty much, every single year at our demonstration garden, we have tons and tons of cabbage worms and loopers on our cabbage plants and a little bit on like our collards. So we pretty much now spray this as a preventative for that. I really wish we didn't have to, but our demonstration garden is like, it's a great demonstration of lots of pests as well. So if you find like every year your cabbage plants have tons of things eating it, doing some BT is really great. I really like this insecticide because it's so specific, which if it's that specific, it usually means it's not going to be, it doesn't really damage any other pests, any other insects or things like that. So kind of getting away from the sprays is diatomaceous earth. So if you're using this, use some eye protection or some type of mask, which we all have now. And putting this onto the leaves of plants and then also kind of at the base of plants. These are basically just tiny rocks. So any soft-bodied insects, it'll stop. Anytime it rains or if you're watering on your plants, it will remove it. So you do probably have to keep adding this to it. But as long as you don't ingest it or get it in your eyes, it's perfectly safe. Kaolin clay, also like the brand usually Surround, you'll see is similar to the diatomaceous earth, but it's in more of a like even more powdery form. It's a nice barrier for preventing some egg laying. We don't use it a ton, but I do know like quite a few growers that use it pretty religiously. It's washed away from rain. If you do have a lot of problems with slugs, which we don't, but there's just like based on your kind of like where you're growing, sometimes some people just have tons of slug problems. Kaolin clay works really well. And this is so like some people use it, they'll like basically put kaolin clay right on their seedlings right when they're even starting to plant them. So here's a good kind of little image of it. But you can also put it on the same way as you do your diatomaceous earth. Getting into a little bit more toxic is your pyrethrins. These are some broad spectrum insecticides. They affect the nervous system of pests. And this is one of those where it's organic. It's made from chrysanthemum flowers, but it is still something that just because it's organic does not mean it's like safe to like handle or things like that. There's still some, just because it's organic doesn't mean that it's bad. It's great. So if you're going to use it, just make sure you're really following what's on the bottle. And really, I find this one is kind of one of those I put it last out of all these. It's one of these last resort ones. So I would say go with those other ones first. If they're not really being super effective, then you can kind of go to the pyrethrin. Same with the spinosad. It's also in there. It's also effective against pretty much everything. It's a little bit safer than your pyrethrin, so I'd recommend it a little better. But yeah, and it was kind of fun. It was found from a bacteria discovered in a rum barrel, which was just interesting. And then there's some fungicides. Some of these fungicides you'll see will even just have neem in them, but your copper fungicide, if you specifically have like some really bad mildew or some funguses, copper fungicide works really well. Sulfur, and then whey definitely as a preventative. It's not really, you wouldn't even really call it a pesticide because it's really just providing a good, it's kind of increasing the microbiome of your leaf. There's some really cool research on that, definitely in like fruit trees and things like that, but also you can see it in your annual plants with squashes and stuff like that. And then just with any spray, first, make sure you read and follow those labels. Definitely because even between different types of chemicals based on concentrations and things like that, use your appropriate protective equipment, buy a good sprayer. If you go to the garden store, Home Depot, don't buy the cheapest one. go up like one level more. You have to pump them and it, creates pressure. So a little bit nicer one doesn't break as often. Try to avoid spraying during the bloom. But if you are, really make sure you're not hitting those flowers with any of these. So. And then just kind of in summary, but like with our prevention is key, looking for those good quality seeds and seedlings and really thinking about that disease resistance at the beginning. Really focus on building that great soil health to avoid buildup of pests. And then if you see some bare soil out there, first think if you can plant a plant there. And if you can't, look at a type of mulch you could use. So. All right, and then just some information on some websites I like, some extension websites here in the Midwest that I really like, and Cornell's Home Gardening is great. To be honest, I don't know if these links are active anymore, but yeah. So Megan, I think that is it.
Okay, we have a lot of questions.
So it kept buzzing, so.
Yeah. So in the beginning, when you were showing some pictures of different crops and like companion planting, they noticed they were really close together.
Yeah.
Especially like the onions and the collards. Is it fine to have them that close together, or is it just because those specific plants can be closer together?
Good. That's a very good question. I'm going to make sure I point that out next time. So this is kind of, and I guess maybe I just didn't exactly point it out, but like that kind of vertical space in using things. So if you're reading those seed packets and they'll be like, your collards need to be 12 inches apart or whatever. But that's if like, all those collard plants are going to be the same size. They all have the same sunlight requirements. With alliums and onions, they require so little space and they don't need a ton of sunlight and they just do great. You can plant them tight like that and really don't worry about it. It's really that airflow is I would think about and find proper spacing is for your tomato plants, your squash plants, and your cucumbers. So planting those two close together with others of the same variety of the same species, so like more tomatoes next to tomatoes, which would reduce airflow, which then increase pests. So those three really keep the spacing guidelines and follow those. But for like collards with like onions and some like carrots and tomatoes or some like other flowering plants around, like some non-flowering plants, you can plant them pretty close together. It's kind of one of those, like, as you keep growing, you kind of figure out the heights of different things and what you can pair well together. So I hope that helped.
Okay. Also with, we have several about mulch. So at one point you had an onion in the picture and they asked if you can mulch around onions and how close to the onions, if it matters, the mulch is.
You can mulch around onions, though I think a lot of people get a little confused with, so like garlic, you mulch around garlic and you usually do that, but with onions, you don't really have to. Like you don't have to keep adding mulch because they're going to be poking out of the ground. That's perfectly fine. But if you are going to mulch around onions, you could just use like a straw. You don't have to use like a compost or leaf mulch as much if you're trying to figure out where to use the most effective ones. But
they don't need as many nutrients as like garlic would.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. One person asked, do you want to layer different types of mulch?
Oh, I mean, yeah, if you've got, I guess I always come at the approach of like, what's the lowest, what's the easiest and cheapest? So if you do have like other types, like if you have multiple types, you could kind of do those, like you see like lasagna gardening kind of stuff. If you do have like compost and leaf mulch and you're like, I'm going to use both, then I would do compost first and then leaf mulch on top. Just make sure you don't put the straw or the wood mulch on the bottom. Those should always be the last, because if you incorporate those into soil, as they break down, they're going to be pulling a lot of nitrogen out of the soil, so you're losing nutrients in your soil. Okay.
A few people asked, why should you not incorporate wood chips or straw into the soil?
That was pretty much it.
Okay.
If you do, like, there are some specific times you could, like if you have some really heavy soil and you're trying to find something to really kind of add to the soil, then straw or wood mulch can do it. Just really make sure you know that you're going to be, like, it does take a significant amount of nitrogen to break both of those down.
Okay. The free compost and wood mulch that the city provides, someone asked if we would consider it clean enough to put on vegetable beds and if it transmits any diseases.
We've been putting it on ours for, I think, as long as Gateway Greening's been at the demonstration garden, so for decades. I would say in the last couple of years, it does seem a little bit better, at least at our site. It used to be really like we had to pick through it to get the glass and things out of. So I wouldn't really be worried much about disease, because like temperature wise, they're cooking that stuff to where it's really hot. The biggest concern with it is like broken glass and things, because they don't filter it super well. So if you find you don't like those, I mean, in St. Louis, I mean, you can just, if you want to, it's really like, it's free, so it's easy to get, but if you want to get stuff that's really nice, you can pay for it, and you can order it from like St. Louis Composting. They can deliver it. You can go out to a garden center, things like that. So.
One person had a question about straw, because last year they used straw they bought at a big box hardware store, and their veggie leaves looked like they had signs of herbicide damage. Mm-hmm. They asked if we have a list of places where they can buy straw that doesn't, and I said it's probably best to just ask your local nursery where they got it.
Yeah, I would do that. And that does seem to be, your nursery hopefully should know, because that is like a common thing I've heard. So it's not something just kind of random and out of nowhere. So they should be prepared for that question.
And then another question related to damage. Is there a good row cover that can prevent drift damage from their neighbors? No,
not really. So if you do have some if you have some pretty significant like drift damage from your neighbor, and you're like noticing it, then like a row cover, I mean, they're designed specifically to let in sunlight, water, air, just like reducing it a little bit. I mean, you can go up in amount. So like you can get like Agribon is a pretty common brand. So you can get like the Agribon 50, which I think is like, it lets in half the sunlight or something, which is like pretty heavy duty. But then every time you're going up, you're letting in less sunlight. So it's really not probably that great. If you do have that, I would think of like, if we had like a significant problem with that, I would think about putting up like a natural barrier of non-edible plants between you and your neighbor, to hopefully maybe just like catch some of that drift so it doesn't make it into the rest of your space, or go talk with your neighbor. But I'm assuming that person's probably already thought of that.
I hope so. One person did say in the chat that OK Hatchery sells organic straw. So that's a local resource that people can use for that. A few things about bugs. So people asked about controlling stink bugs, squash bugs, and cucumber beetles, and if you would use a spray for that.
First, that's definitely one of those. I would look at doing a barrier first, and doing your rotations, not growing in the same bed that you grew those whatever plants in before. Your pyrethrin and spinosad can work somewhat well. Those are the three where they're really tough to deal with sprays. Really getting them early, to where there's only a couple in your garden. Looking at, let me see if I can find that picture of those eggs. Anytime you see any eggs like this on the back side of your leaves, really making sure you're crushing those, so doing that scouting of your plants. But really there isn't a great, those are all pests that are just like, there really isn't a great spray to do much. You could plant, and there really aren't a ton of great companion plantings to really prevent them. You could plant a couple more alliums around, so you could do some chives, some onions, things like that. That could help a little bit, but I'd say really getting them early in the season. So like in April, be looking around. In May, look around and make sure you like are paying attention to your plants. And if you see any, pull them out and put them in some soapy water, and then crush any eggs you see. So, and then if you do have a lot of those problems, I would not use straw in your beds, in those beds, because it really gives them a great space that you can't see for them to reproduce.
Okay. Does neem oil kill good bugs?
It will. I mean, like, it's a pretty broad spectrum. That's the one thing. Usually you won't be seeing a lot of those. So it's one of those, like, it's direct contact. So like, it's just like an insecticidal soap where if you spray it on them, it'll be attacking them that way. And then it does actually soak into the plant as well. So it can prevent, it can also from pests that eat the plant leaves. So as long as you're not spraying it like on like ladybugs and things like that, you're going to be fine. So just kind of pay attention to where you're spraying.
And do you know if there's like a DIY recipe for your own insecticidal soap?
Yeah, I would imagine. What's that brand of soap that you can use for everything? The Dr. Bronner's, is that what it is? I don't know of any. We just have some sitting around, so I haven't tried to make any, but I would imagine you probably could.
Okay. And then the last question that I see regarding bare soil, is it better to mulch or to plant something, or does it really matter?
Best to plant something, because you get those interactions of those plant roots with the soil, and you're just getting a lot more microorganisms. And if you're going to eat it, that's great too. But if not, like, you still just have a plant in the ground, which is good. And so I pick the plant first. Now, if it's going to be crowding out some other plants that you really want, then that's where kind of the mulching comes in. Or if you just have to maintain that spacing, that's where the mulch is.
And I did have one more. Is using Shasta daisies or chrysanthemums effective at pest control?
I've seen chrysanthemums thrown in sometimes with people mentioning with like companion plantings and like repelling plants. We've never really done it. I don't know. I haven't seen it. I've never tried it. So I don't know. Do you, Megan, do you have any comment on that?
I have not heard of those.
Yeah.
I have to research it and see.
Yeah. I mean, that list I had is pretty good. I mean, if you, there's tons of lists. I really think of it first though, as with your flowering plants of like, first, what flowers do you want to see? And then what flowers of those that you want to see are really like that bloom often and bloom consistently, so that you can get lots and lots of insects in there. So not that just like they bloom at one time of the season and they're done, but they just keep blooming. Those are really, that's what kind of is that category. And that's why those specific flowering plants are listed, which is somewhere in the presentation, or that's what you'll see online as well. So.
Okay, and then one more question and then we're done, I swear. Someone asked about using 7 insect spray.
7 insect spray. I do not. Is that a brand, I'm guessing?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know the, so like these were just images that like we use a lot of these brands.
I don't believe it's an organic.
Okay, that might be why I've never heard of it. I mean, like, I wouldn't say if it's a non-organic spray, it's like the worst thing in the world. I would just really, if for some reason I was thinking about using it, I would do a lot of research on it. But I would imagine, like, if it's not organic, it's not organic for a reason. So it's not like the same with like organic farmers where they're like non-organic because they don't want to pay to become certified. Like if you're making a spray, you've probably got enough money to get certified. So I don't know anything about it.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you everybody for attending. And like I said, this will be uploaded to YouTube tomorrow, so you can check that out if you'd like to rewatch it or watch any of the other sessions. So thanks everybody and have a good night.
All right, thanks everybody.